Okay, today we're going to talk about how to multiply integers using an algorithm, or another word for an algorithm is the rule. So we're going to come up with this algorithm or this rule by modeling, by using models. Okay, remember that multiplication is the same as repeated addition. So 2 times 5 would be the same thing as 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2. But I would rather do this little multiplication, 2 times 5, than do 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2. That's a lot of work. So that's why multiplication is our friend. So 3 times 2, it means 3 groups of 2. In other words, you would have 2 positive counters, and you would have 3 groups of 2 in each group. Okay, so what that means here, that's exactly what it means. We're going to use models. 3 times 2, that means you have a group of 2, you have another group of 2, you have another group of 2. So you have 3 groups of 2 positive integers. In this case over here, you have 3 times negative 2. So if I was going to do that one, I would have to show 3 groups of negative counters. And each group is going to have 2 negative counters. So it would be that and that and that. Okay, so in order for me to model this, 3 times negative 2 would be 3 groups of 2 negative counters in each group. Okay, you can see that the answer here is 6 total counters, right? So the answer here is positive 6. Here the answer is 6 total counters as well. In this case, the counters are negative, so the answer would be negative 6. Okay, so now let's talk about this in the number lines. Okay, if we're starting at 0, like we always do, this means you need to have 3 times 2, right? 3 groups of 2. So I'm going to jump, and because it's a positive 2, this number right here, I'm going to jump to the right. So I'm going to jump, there's one jump, and then we're going to do another jump. That's 2 groups, and then finally another jump. So that's 3 groups. So my final answer is positive 6. Because we're going to the right, because the counters are positive. Okay, remember the first number is the number of groups. So you might want to write that down. The first number is the number of groups. The second number is the number of counters inside each group. And I'm going to ask you this tomorrow. See if you actually watched the video. What does the first number mean? What does the second number mean? So make sure that you pay attention on that. Okay, and this one, the way we model it, again, we start at 0. We always start at 0. But this time we're going to jump to the left because we have 2 negative counters. So we got to go in the left direction. Okay, so here we go. We're going to do 1. We're going to do 2. And finally, we're going to do 3 jumps to the left. So my answer is negative 6. And that's how you model it with counters. And that's how you model it with number lines. Okay, now what happens if the first number is a negative number like this? Well, what this really means is the opposite of 3 groups of 2. So we already know what 3 groups of 2 is way up, is right here, right? So the opposite of 3 groups of 2 is exactly that, the opposite of it. Let me see if I can bring this down a little bit. There we go. Okay, so since we had 3 groups of 2 positive counters, the opposite of that would be 3 groups of negative counters. So in this case, we would have the opposite, which would be 3 groups of 2 negative counters inside each group. So in this case, my answer would be negative 6. And the way we model that on the number line is we actually work it out with the positive, because we don't take care of this negative here, and we don't read it as a negative, by the way. We read it as an opposite, the opposite of 3 groups of 2. So in this case, we're going to do 2 groups of 2, 3 groups of 2, 1, 2, and 3 groups of 2. And now we're going to find the opposite. Since this is positive 6, the opposite is going to be negative 6. So we have to jump all the way back to its opposite. Okay, remember that the opposite, all it is the number that is equal distant from 0 to that number. Okay, so because this is 6 units apart, then that means that the opposite is going to be 6 units apart as well. So that's why the answer is not 6 in this case, but negative 6, because of that little bitty symbol right there that needs to say the opposite of it. Okay, so the same thing we're going to do over here. In this case up here, we already know what 3 groups of -2 means. Well, here this means the opposite of 3 groups of -2. Okay, now the model of counters is right here. Now let's talk about the model of number lines right here. And the model with the number lines is going to be just like we did before, where we're going to start at 0. And just like this one up here, we're going to go to the left twice because of this number right here. This tells us which direction we go. So we're going to go left once, twice, and 3 times. Okay, and now I'm going to take care of this symbol, which is not a -3 but the opposite. Remember, we read that as the opposite of 3 groups. So in this case, it's going to be the opposite of 3 jumps to the left, which ended up at -6. Well, if we're looking at the number line, the opposite of -6, we're looking for the number that's 6 spaces from 0 to the other side of 0. So that's going to give me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That means my answer is going to be +6. So if I'm looking for the opposite of that, then the opposite is going to be all the way over here at +6. Now let's look at these problems real quick. We just did 4 problems with kind of like the same answers, kind of like the same numbers. So let's see if we can come up with some rules. Let's see if we can find any patterns. Okay, here we multiplied 3 times 2 and we got 6. +3 times +2 equals 6. That makes sense. Okay, here on this one we multiplied +3 times -2 and we got -6. So a positive times a negative gave us a negative. Okay, and on this one right here we multiplied a -3 times a +2 and we got -6. So here we see that a negative times a positive equals a negative. And then on the last one we multiplied a -3 times a -2 and that gave us +6. So let's see what's going on here. If we have no, well actually the way I want you to look at this real quick to see if you can figure it out is look at the 2 numbers that we got that were positive. There's a +6 and there's a +6 there. Notice that we have no negative signs right here. Notice that we have 2 negative signs right here. Okay, now let's look at the numbers that we got -6 for our answer. It was this one and it was this one, right? Both of those are -6. Oops, I highlighted the wrong one. That one. So -6 and -6. And notice that you have 1 negative on this problem, and on this one you also have only 1 negative sign. This negative sign, and you have that negative sign. So I guess we can say that if you have 0 negatives or 2 negatives, you get a positive answer. And if you have only 1 negative sign, like this one or this one, then your answer is going to be negative. So I think that we can go a little bit farther though now and write down these patterns right here. Okay, so let's talk about this right quick. If we had a positive and we multiplied times another positive, we got a positive. The other way we can get a positive answer was if we multiplied a negative times a negative. And then when we multiplied a positive times a negative, we got a negative answer. And the last one, when we multiplied a negative times a positive, we also got a negative answer. Okay, so these are my rules that I need to remember for whenever I multiply integers. Positive times a positive equals a positive. Negative times a negative equals a positive also. But positive times a negative equals a negative, and negative times a positive equals a negative. If you think that's a lot to remember the way I just read it, I would agree with you, because that sounds a little confusing. So the easy way to remember this is, look at the number of negatives we have. We have 2. That's an even number, right? Even number of negatives. That's only 2 negatives. Here we have only 1 negative. That's an odd number of negatives. That's an odd number. There's just one negative. Here we only have also one negative. That's also an odd number of negatives. It's just one. And here we have no negatives. So I guess we can call even. Well, let's not call it even because 0 is not an even number. It cannot be divided by 2. So we'll just call it 0. If you have 0 number of negatives, then you have a positive answer. Okay, so in other words, what if you have negative times a negative times a negative? What is that going to be? Well, remember we said if it's even number of negatives, it's going to be a positive answer. Let me highlight that for you. If it's an even number of negatives, then our answer is going to be positive. Okay, but if it's an odd number of negatives, then our answer is going to be negative. Here we have how many negatives? 1, 2, 3, right? So that is that an even number or an odd number? 3. 3 is odd. So because it's an odd number of negatives, our answer is going to be a negative answer. Okay? What if you have a positive times a negative times a positive times a negative number? What kind of answer are you going to end up with? Well, let's see. Remember we said even is positive, odd is negative. So let's see how many negatives we have. We have this negative and we have this negative. We only have 2 negatives. That 2, number 2, is an even number. So because we have only 2 negatives, that's an even number. So we're talking about our answer being a positive answer. Whatever answer we get is going to have to be a positive number. Okay, and this is the important part, the stuff that I highlighted. If it's an even number of negatives, your answer is going to be a positive answer. If it's an odd number of negative signs, then your answer is going to be a negative answer. Okay, so hopefully you understood that. Alright, so now let's talk about these rules that we just wrote. Let's see if we can use them right quick. Okay, so let's find the product. Here we have a positive 5 and a positive 3. Remember, positive times a positive equals a positive. So 5 times 3 is just positive 15. Okay, now 5 times 3, again 15. 5 times 3, again 15. 5 times 3, yeah, 15. Okay, but now we're going to talk about the negatives. How many negatives do I have right here? I have 2 negative signs. That's an even number of negatives, so I know my answer is going to be positive. That's what we said back here. If it's even numbers, even number of negative signs, my answer is going to be positive. Over here we have only 1 negative. That's an odd number, right? Because an odd number, then our answer is going to be negative. Here we only have 1 negative. Again, it's also odd. So because it's an odd, we also going to have a negative answer. You see how that works? Okay, I'm going to do 2 more and then you do the other 2. Okay, so I'm going to do this one right here. Negative times a positive. I already know my answer is going to be negative. There's only 1 negative. So 5 times 4 is 20, so my answer is negative 20. Here I have a positive times a positive. I don't have any negatives. And when I don't have any negatives, when I have 0 number of negatives, my answer is always going to be positive because there's no negatives to deal with. So 2 times 12 is just 24. Positive 24. And I'll let you do this one and I'll let you do that one. See what you come up with. One of those is a trick question. I'll give you that much. Alright, well that's it for multiplying. Now go watch the dividing decimals. Dividing integers.